They always say every nation's crisis is unique, that Greece was a special case, that Argentina was mismanaged, that Japan's stagnation was cultural, and that America is simply too big to fail. But that's the lie every superpower tells itself right before it enters the same debt spiral that destroyed the ones who came before it. So today, I'm going to show you a pattern almost no one in government wants you to understand, a pattern the banking elite never criticize, a pattern that keeps repeating across continents, decades, and empires until it breaks everything. It's a five-phase sequence. Greece lived it. Argentina keeps reliving it. Japan froze inside it. And right now, whether Americans want to admit it or not, the United States just stepped deep into phase 4. But before we get there, you need to know how the spiral begins. Because it never starts with chaos. It never begins with panic in the streets, or riots, or bank runs. No, a debt spiral begins in the quietest way possible. It starts with success. The first phase is always prosperity, the kind that feels permanent, the kind that convinces nations they've finally outsmarted history, the kind that tricks leaders into believing they can borrow more today, because tomorrow will always be bigger. Greece believed that in the early 2000s. Argentina believed it in the 1990s. Japan believed it in the 1980s. And the United States, it believed it after 1980, after 1990, after 2008, and especially after 2020. The story is always the same. Growth rises, tax revenue climbs, politicians spend, voters get comfortable, credit becomes easy, debt becomes normal, and slowly, quietly, subtly, a nation crosses the line from borrowing for growth to borrowing to maintain the illusion of growth. That line is invisible. There's no alarm, no headlines, no emergency session in Congress. But once a nation steps over it, the math changes permanently because debt has a gravity. It pulls everything downward. Interest rates, wages, investment, the currency, and eventually the society itself. And once the gravity becomes stronger than the growth, the spiral begins. This is where the United States now stands, on the other side of that invisible line. You can see it in the numbers they try to hide in plain sight. The federal government adds $1 trillion of new debt every 100 days. Interest costs now exceed the defense budget. The Treasury is issuing more debt than global markets can comfortably absorb. Foreign demand for US bonds is shrinking. And the Federal Reserve, the only buyer large enough to stabilize the system, is trapped between inflation and insolvency. These are not the indicators of a functioning empire. These are the cracks of phase 4. But there's a deeper reason this matters. Because once a nation enters the spiral, its fate is no longer determined by policy, or elections, or promises, or speeches. It's determined by mathematics. And no empire has ever negotiated its way out of mathematics. Not Spain, not Britain, not the Soviet Union, not Greece, not Argentina, not Japan. And unless something dramatic changes, the United States won't be the first. This is the beginning of the 5-phase collapse sequence, the one every superpower thinks it can avoid right until the moment it realizes it's been living inside it for years. Every collapse has a moment where the story changes, but almost no one notices it when it happens. There's no dramatic speech, no market crash, no breaking news alert. It's quiet, subtle, and it always looks harmless at first. This is phase 2, the trigger phase. The moment when prosperity stops being a blessing and becomes a trap. Because here's the truth nobody likes to admit. Prosperity teaches nations the worst possible habits. When everything feels safe, leaders stop asking hard questions. Citizens stop paying attention, and the system stops preparing for the future. Greece fell into this trap in the early 2000s. Argentina fell into it in the 1990s. Japan fell into it in the late 1980s. And America, it has been falling into it every decade since the 1970s. But what exactly triggers the spiral? 2 things. And the brutal part is, both of them look harmless when they begin. Trigger 1. The government promises more than the economy can deliver. This is where the cycle always starts. Politicians discover that borrowing is easier than honesty. Why raise taxes and anger voters when you can borrow quietly and let the bill show up after the next election? So spending climbs, debt climbs, expectations climb, and the public gets addicted to the illusion that the government can always afford more. More benefits, more programs, more wars, more subsidies, more everything. Greece borrowed until its public sector was larger than its private economy. Argentina borrowed until even basic subsidies became political landmines. Japan borrowed until its interest bill became untouchable. And America, it borrowed until 75% of its budget became mandatory. Locked in, impossible to cut, mathematically guaranteed to grow forever. This is the point where governments stop making choices and start making excuses. Because once obligations become permanent, the only path forward is deeper debt. That's the first trigger. Trigger 2. The population starts believing the system can't fail. This is the psychological shift that seals the fate. People stop asking, can we afford this? And start saying, why shouldn't we have it? The public stops demanding discipline. They start demanding comfort. And leaders, terrified of losing power, give it to them. This is when denial becomes national policy. Japan denied its bubble until it created 3 decades of stagnation. Greece denied its accounting until the EU forced it into austerity. Argentina denied its inflation until citizens lost their savings again, and again, and again. And America denies everything. It denies inflation. It denies debt sustainability. It denies geopolitical overreach. It denies the collapse of foreign demand for US bonds. It denies that interest payments are now the fastest growing part of the federal budget. Denial is the most predictable behavior of every empire, because empires believe they are immune to consequences. They all say the same thing. We're different. We're bigger. We're stronger. It can't happen here. Every nation that uttered those words was already in phase 2. The trigger phase always feels safe, until it doesn't. This phase is the most dangerous because it feels harmless. The stock market is rising. Banks seem stable. Investors are optimistic. Consumers are spending. Politicians are smiling. This is exactly what Argentina looked like in 1997. Exactly what Greece looked like in 2007. Exactly what Japan looked like in 1989. And it's exactly what America looked like in 2021. People mistake calm for safety, but calm is the final warning before the spiral accelerates. Phase 2 ends the moment debt stops being a tool and becomes a dependency. Once that line is crossed, phase 3 begins, the phase every empire fears, but none can avoid, the acceleration phase. Phase 2 is denial. Phase 3 is speed. This is the point where the system stops drifting and starts sliding, where debt stops being a strategy and becomes a threat, where the numbers stop growing linearly and start growing exponentially. Economists won't admit this, politicians won't admit this, central bankers definitely won't admit this, but every major collapse in history, from Greece to Argentina to Japan to the late-stage European empires, accelerated the moment interest costs overtook economic growth. Because once the cost of debt rises faster than the economy, the system begins eating itself alive. This is phase 3, the acceleration phase, and the United States has already entered it. 1. Debt doesn't rise, it compounds. The biggest lie governments sell is that a nation borrows money. It doesn't. A nation borrows time, and time has a price. In Greece, that price exploded after 2007. Debt compounds faster than GDP, faster than wages, faster than tax revenue. Everything the government collects goes straight into the furnace. The same thing happened in Argentina. The same thing happened in Japan. And now the same thing is happening in the United States, but on a scale the world has never seen. The US now adds $1 trillion every 100 days, $8 billion of interest every 24 hours, more debt annually than the entire US tax base produces. This isn't borrowing, this is acceleration. And acceleration always ends the same way. 2. The interest trap springs. Shut out. Once interest becomes the largest or fastest growing expense in the entire government budget, the game is over. Japan hit this trap in the 1990s. Greece hit it in 2009. Argentina hits it every 5 years. And America hit it quietly in 2023. No press conferences, no warnings. Interest is now bigger than Medicaid, bigger than veterans benefits, bigger than transportation, almost as big as the defense budget, and growing faster than every other category combined. This is the moment where the math turns irreversible. Once interest overtakes growth, the spiral feeds itself. More debt, higher interest, more debt, lower growth, higher deficits, more debt. And the cycle tightens until the system suffocates. You don't negotiate your way out of this. You don't vote your way out of this. You don't stimulus your way out. There is only one direction left. Down. 3. The market begins to flinch. This phase is subtle at first. Foreign bond buyers step back. US banks quietly reduce treasury exposure. Yields rise a little more than expected. The Fed hesitates longer than usual. Volatility increases in small, forgettable spikes. These tiny fractures always happen before the break. Greece saw it. Argentina saw it. Japan saw it. Every failing empire saw it. America is seeing it now. Major bond auctions requiring emergency buyers. Rising yields during periods of supposed stability. Foreign central banks dumping treasuries. Rising short-term borrowing just to cover interest. These aren't glitches. They're signals. Signals that the acceleration is beginning to overwhelm the system. 4. The public still thinks everything is fine. This is the strangest part of phase 3. While the math is breaking, the public feels completely normal. Stocks are up, jobs look stable. The news cycle is calm, the dollar seems strong. This exact calm existed in Greece in 2008, Argentina in 2016, Japan in 1990. Acceleration is invisible until it's not. Phase 3 is the last phase, before control is lost. After this point come the stages everyone remembers. Bank failures, currency shocks, market crashes, political chaos, forced restructuring. But none of that happens randomly. It all begins in phase 3. The acceleration is the warning shot. Every debt spiral reaches a moment where the walls start closing in. Not gradually, not subtly, but sharply. This is phase 4, the compression point, the moment when every choice a nation avoided for decades comes crashing down at the same time. The moment Greece hit in 2010, Argentina hit in 2001, Japan hit in 1998, and the moment the United States is quietly stepping into right now. The compression point isn't about panic, it's about pressure. Pressure so intense that even the strongest economies find themselves running out of exits, because this is where the math stops bending and starts breaking. 1. The government can no longer pay its bills without new debt. This is the first sign. When a nation reaches the point where tax revenue, already spent debt, only way to function interest, consuming everything, that nation is no longer governing. It's surviving. Greece crossed this line in 2010 when it realized almost every euro of tax revenue was already spoken for before the year even began. Argentina crosses this line every few years. Japan crossed it and froze for 30 years. And America? America crossed it in 2022. Today, the US government cannot operate, not for 1 month, without issuing new debt. This is the definition of a compression point. A government that must borrow simply to exist is a government that has already lost control of its future. 2. The bond market starts dictating policy. In phase 2, politicians still pretend they're in charge. In phase 3, the debt starts dictating terms. But in phase 4, the bond market takes the driver's seat. This is when yields begin rising, not because of inflation, not because of growth, not because of geopolitics, but because investors no longer trust the government to manage itself. Greece saw this first. Bond yields spiked so fast that the government couldn't roll over existing debt. That's when austerity, bailouts, and forced restructuring began. Argentina saw this even more violently. The bond market simply walked away. Japan avoided the spike only because the Bank of Japan turned itself into the sole buyer of its own government's bonds. The United States is now facing the same reality. Bond auctions failing, primary dealers demanding higher yields, foreign buyers disappearing, domestic banks reaching exposure limits, the Federal Reserve trapped between inflation, if it prints, and default risk if it doesn't. When the bond market controls a nation, that nation is no longer sovereign. 3. Every problem starts feeding every other problem. This is the most destructive feature of Phase 4. Nothing is isolated. Debt increases inflation. Inflation increases interest rates. Interest rates increase deficits. Deficits increase borrowing. Borrowing weakens the currency. A weaker currency increases import costs. Higher costs increase inflation. And inflation cycles right back into rising interest rates. This is not a loop. This is a death spiral. Greece saw this spiral destroy its entire economy in 36 months. Argentina saw it wipe out savings multiple times. Japan saw it freeze growth for a generation. The United States is now entering the same feedback loop, but with more leverage, more dependency, and more global exposure than any nation before it. 4. Political choices become mathematically impossible. This is when the public begins to feel the compression. Suddenly, the government can no longer say, "We'll fund everything. We'll fix everything. We'll protect everything." Instead, every choice becomes a sacrifice. If you cut spending, you trigger recession. If you spend more, you fuel inflation. If you raise taxes, you crush growth. If you lower taxes, deficits explode. If you raise interest rates, debt becomes unpayable. If you cut interest rates, inflation becomes uncontrollable. Every path leads to pain. This is what Greece learned, what Argentina learned, what Japan learned, and what America is now learning. The compression point ends political fantasy and begins economic reality. 5. This phase decides whether a country collapses or transforms. Most countries fail here. Some survive, but none escape unchanged. Greece surrendered sovereignty to Europe. Argentina surrendered stability to inflation. Japan surrendered growth for survival. What will the United States surrender? That's the question every economist is too afraid to answer. Because Phase 4 isn't the end. Phase 4 is the moment every hidden weakness finally becomes visible. Phase 5, the final break, is when everything the nation denied, everything it postponed, everything it avoided comes due all at once. At this point, the country isn't managing debt. It's performing CPR on a corpse. Tax revenue can't keep up. Interest payments grow faster than GDP, and governments start playing accounting games that would land any CEO in prison. You see creative tricks like off-budget spending, special purpose vehicles, temporary emergency measures that somehow last a decade, unrealized deficits that magically become someone else's future problem. Japan pioneered the technique. Argentina abused it. Greece tried to hide it. And America. America is using all of them at once. Because when a system reaches this stage, politicians stop governing and start improvising. They aren't building the future. They're delaying a funeral. Debt becomes the operating system of the economy. Borrowing isn't optional. It's survival. And here's the part everyone pretends not to see. When interest payments exceed defense spending, a country stops being a superpower. When they exceed tax revenue, it stops being a country. Guess which line the US just crossed? New debt isn't financing growth. It's financing yesterday's promises. The country enters what economists politely call the slow grind. But let's drop the euphemisms. This is the moment when decline becomes irreversible unless leaders take painful, career-ending decisions. And no one in Washington signs up to lose an election. So what happens? They stall, they freeze, they point fingers, and the clock keeps ticking. This phase always ends the same way. Not with a dramatic collapse, but with a gradual suffocation of opportunity, innovation, and upward mobility. Ask Japan, ask Greece, ask Argentina. A nation doesn't wake up poor one morning. It wakes up realizing it spent 20 years pretending everything was fine. America just entered that timeline. Every debt spiral has a moment where the math stops mattering. Because the problem is no longer numbers, it's trust. A nation survives impossible debt loads as long as people believe the system still works. Once that belief cracks, the collapse accelerates faster than any model can predict. Look at Argentina. The numbers were bad, yes. But the moment citizens realized their savings were evaporating faster than they could withdraw them, the system imploded in weeks, not years. Greece held on for a decade. Until one summer afternoon when the ECB said, "We're done." Overnight, banks shut down and ATMs rationed cash like wartime medicine. Japan avoided this stage only because its citizens trust the government with almost religious intensity. But even that is now eroding under the weight of stagnant wages and a generation that no longer believes in sacrifice. And now the United States, a country that built its empire on credibility, is running straight into this same wall. Confidence is cracking on three fronts. One, global buyers are stepping back. China, Japan, Saudi Arabia, the old loyal customers of US debt, are quietly reducing exposure. Not dumping, just drifting away. That's how confidence collapses, slowly, invisibly, and then all at once. Two, domestic faith is wearing thin. When the average American needs record debt to survive a record economy, that's not prosperity, that's a warning. When people see Washington arguing about budgets while interest payments swallow the budget, they stop trusting the story. Three, the markets are starting to whisper. Bond yields spike with any small shock. Volatility is rising. And rating agencies, once terrified of downgrading the US, are now doing it casually. This stage isn't loud, it's not dramatic, and it doesn't trend on Twitter. It's a psychological shift, a quiet realization spreading through investors, savers, and institutions. This system might not fix itself, and no one has a plan. Once that idea takes root, the spiral moves to the final phases, the ones that are no longer reversible. Every debt spiral eventually hits a moment where the system loses the ability to pretend. Not because politicians admit anything, not because economists predict anything, but because the numbers force reality onto them. This is the phase where debt stops being an abstract national issue and becomes a direct threat to everyday life. And for America, phase 4 is pushing it dangerously close to that edge. Here's what the breaking point actually looks like. 1. Interest payments become the real government when a nation spends more on interest than on its military, infrastructure, or children. That nation is no longer in control of its priorities. That's where the US is now. Interest payments just passed. Defense spending, Medicaid federal education programs. The government isn't choosing where the money goes. The debt is choosing for them. When Japan hit this stage in the late 1990s, everything froze. Growth died. Wages stagnated. And the next 25 years became a slow motion collapse. The US is entering that same tunnel, but with a far more fragile social fabric. 2. Budgets turn into fiction. Once the cost of debt dominates the budget, the government has only 3 choices. Cut spending, raise taxes. Print money in reality. They'll do none of these meaningfully, because cutting spending is political suicide. Raising taxes triggers backlash, and printing money accelerates inflation. So what do? They fake it. They announce budgets that assume unrealistically low interest rates. They use accounting tricks. They postpone payments. They move liabilities off the books. It's the same playbook Argentina used until the illusion collapsed. 3. The private sector gets squeezed. When the government absorbs all available capital just to service its debt, something brutal happens. Businesses can't borrow cheaply. Consumers can't borrow cheaply. And growth suffocates. This is how Greece got trapped. The government's survival suffocated the economy that was supposed to support it. In America, you're already seeing the signs. Credit card APRs at 27 to 30%, auto loans turning into mini mortgages, small businesses drowning in debt, young families priced out of everything. This is not a functioning economy. This is an economy gasping for oxygen while the government hogs the air supply. 4. Markets stop believing the policymakers. This is the final symptom, the one that signals the system is about to switch from unstable to unrecoverable. When the Federal Reserve says inflation is under control and bond markets barely react, that's distrust. When the Treasury announces more auctions and investors demand higher yields, that's distrust. When every statement from Washington creates more questions than answers, that's distrust. A debt spiral becomes fatal when the markets decide the government is improvising. And the US is one headline, one crisis, one shock away from that moment. Phase 4 is where the collapse becomes self-feeding. Phase 5 is where it becomes irreversible. This is the part nobody believes will happen, until it has already happened. Every country in a debt spiral reaches a moment where the system doesn't adjust. It breaks instantly, violently, and permanently. For the US, Phase 5 isn't some cinematic collapse. It's a mathematical endpoint. And once you understand the pattern followed by Greece, Argentina, Japan, and every empire before them, you'll see exactly why America just stepped onto the same tracks. 1. The market loses patience. Overnight debt spirals never end slowly. They end suddenly. Because markets aren't emotional, they're mechanical. When investors decide treasuries no longer pay enough for the risk, or the US can't stabilize inflation, or the political system can't execute a solution, they will not give warnings. They will not negotiate. They will not be patriotic. They will simply stop buying. This is what triggered Greece's collapse in 2010. This is what detonated Argentina in 2001. And this is what nearly froze global markets in March 2020 until the Federal Reserve performed emergency CPR. America doesn't get a grace period in Phase 5. It gets a cliff. 2. Treasury auctions. Start failing people think collapse looks like riots. It doesn't. It looks like insufficient demand at today's auction. That's it. When the US government tries to sell billions in bonds and the market demands higher yields before buying, the cost of debt spikes instantly. A single bad auction can add hundreds of billions to future interest payments. Japan experienced this shock in 2023. The US experienced warning tremors in 2024 and 2025. You won't see politicians panicking on camera, but behind the scenes, phones light up, emergency meetings start, and the system realizes the buyers just walked away. 3. The Fed steps in and makes it worse. When the market refuses to buy treasuries at reasonable rates, the Federal Reserve becomes the buyer of last resort. Here's the fatal irony. The more the Fed buys, the more the dollar weakens. The weaker the dollar becomes, the more investors run. This feedback loop destroyed Argentina's currency. It shattered Greece's ability to borrow, and it turned Japan into a trapped, deflationary zombie economy. The US is walking into the same trap, except with global reserve currency obligations that magnify every shock. 4. The public finally feels it, all at once. While phases 1 through 4 were slow burns, phase 5 hits regular Americans brutally fast. Mortgage rates explode, credit markets freeze, layoffs accelerate, pensions wobble. The stock market loses support, the dollar weakens, import prices spike, savings evaporate. This is not doom, this is arithmetic. When the cost of money breaks, everything priced in money breaks with it. Argentina called this moment la explosión. Greece called it the cut. America will call it something else, but the effect will be the same. 5. Political chaos seals the collapse. And then comes the final blow. Every collapsing economy hits a political stage where no party can agree on a solution, because every solution is suicide. Cutting spending hurts voters. Raising taxes angers voters. Printing money destroys savings. Doing nothing accelerates collapse. So politicians do the only thing they've ever been good at. They fight, they deny, they blame, and they stall. Japan stagnated for 30 years because its politicians refused to break the cycle. Argentina collapsed repeatedly because its politicians lied to survive. Greece had riots, austerity, and chaos because its politicians delayed too long. America's political system is far more polarized than all three. Phase 5 doesn't get solved. It gets survived. There's a truth most Americans don't want to hear. Not because it's scary, but because it's final. Debt spirals don't fix themselves. They don't heal with optimism, elections, or patriotic speeches. They end the same way they have ended for every nation in modern history, with a reset. Sometimes controlled, usually not. And the United States, like Greece, Argentina, and Japan, is now close enough to the tipping point that the outcome is no longer theoretical. It's structural. Let's walk through what comes next, because the pattern is brutally consistent and historically unavoidable. 1. The dollar gets rewritten. No currency survives a full debt spiral untouched. Not one. When Greece hit its final stage, it had to accept external control of its monetary system. When Argentina hit its final stage, it reset its currency again and again. Japan avoided a blowout only by sacrificing growth for decades. The US will not dissolve the dollar, but it will redefine it. New monetary frameworks, new digital structures, new rules for banks, new capital flow restrictions, new inflation targets, new obligations on savers. The world's reserve currency doesn't collapse the way smaller currencies do. It mutates to save the system that depends on it. Most Americans won't understand what changed, but they'll feel it every day. 2. The middle class gets hit the hardest. Every debt reset has the same sacrificial victim. Not the banks, not the political class, not the elite investors who already moved their money offshore. It's always the same group. households that played by the rules. They lose spending power savings, retirement value, home affordability, job stability. Because in a debt spiral, the financial system isn't designed to protect individuals. It's designed to protect itself. Argentina's middle class shrank. Greece's middle class vanished. Japan's middle class aged into poverty. The US is heading into the same pattern, and the squeeze has already started. 3. The government expands. Because it has to, debt spirals don't shrink governments, they expand them. Why? Because when markets stop trusting that a country's finances, that country replaces market function with state force, price controls, capital restrictions, emergency lending, direct interventions, banking supervision, digital tracking, new compliance rules. Greece went under the IMF. Argentina went under capital lockdown. Japan became the largest single buyer of its own markets. The US won't submit to external control, but it will centralize authority from within. It has no choice. 4. Investors who understand the pattern. Make fortunes. This is the uncomfortable part. Every major collapse creates winners, not because they're lucky, but because they recognize something most people ignore. Debt spirals are predictable. In 2008, those who understood the mortgage cycle made billions. In Japan, those who understood deflation made generational wealth. In Greece, those who understood austerity bought assets for pennies. In Argentina, those who understood currency resets became the new elite. The United States will be no different. The people who refuse to look away will be the ones who position themselves early. 5. The country doesn't end, but the era does. This is the hardest truth for Americans to accept. A debt spiral doesn't destroy a nation. It destroys an era. The era of cheap credit, the era of unlimited spending, the era of unchallenged reserve status, the era of political stability, the era of predictable markets, the era of painless deficits. Those eras don't return. They evolve into something colder, stricter, and far less forgiving. Greece survived, Argentina survived, Japan survived, but none of them returned to what they were before the snap. Neither will the United States. The pattern is clear. The curve is locked. Phase 5 is not the end of the story. It's the end of the